Massachusetts, sometime in the 1760s. It's breakfast. There's a kid at the table, maybe 7 years old, and there's a cup in front of him. And what's in the cup is alcohol, watered down, sure, but fermented. His mother poured it. His father's drinking the full-strength version. And nobody at that table thinks anything of it, because in that house, on that morning, the apple juice that's been sitting in a barrel since October is the most sensible thing in the room to put in a child. Most people know cider as a seasonal thing. Flannel weather, corn maze, jug of brown juice on the counter next to a bag of donuts. Or the hard version, the fizzy sweet can somebody grabs because they don't want a beer. Cute, harmless, kind of a side character. Start with the part that breaks the whole picture. Apples aren't American. Not one variety in that colonial orchard was native to the continent. The only apple growing wild in North America was a bitter little crabapple nobody wanted. Everything else walked here. And the walk started in the mountains of Central Asia. Second thing, almost every apple in colonial America was inedible. Not my favorite inedible. Mouth-puckering, spit-it-out inedible. Orchards weren't food. They were closer to breweries with roots. And then the premise sitting right there in the title, which deserves a harder look than it usually gets. Everyone repeats that colonists drank cider because water would kill you. Historians have been picking at that one for years, and the real answer is messier, and honestly more interesting than the version you got in school. One more. That barefoot guy from the storybook, the one with the tin pot on his head handing out apples to happy pioneer children? He was running a frontier booze supply chain, deliberately, and he knew exactly what those trees were for. A wild fruit from Kazakhstan, a colony that couldn't trust its own wells, a religious sect, a temperance mob, and a can in a gas station cooler. One continuous story, and it starts with a tree that refuses to make copies of itself. The apple's homeland is the Tian Shan Mountains, on the border of what's now Kazakhstan and China. The wild ancestor is a species called Malus sieversii, and it still grows there in forests where the fruit ranges from pea-sized and vile to genuinely delicious. Kazakhstan's largest city, Almaty, has a name usually read as something close to father of apples. Bears and horses ate the fruit and spread the seeds westward along the corridors that later became the Silk Road. Along the way, the apple crossed with wild European crabapples, picking up traits as it went. By the time it reached the Mediterranean, it was already a heavily traveled, heavily mixed-up plant. Now the word cider doesn't come from apples at all. It traces back through Old French cidre, Latin cicera, Greek sikera, to a Hebrew word shekar, which just meant strong drink. For centuries it meant any intoxicating beverage. The apple attached itself to the word later. The Romans wrote about fermented apple drinks, and there's a much-repeated story that they found Britons drinking something like cider when they arrived. That one's thin. The evidence is more suggestive than solid, so treat it as a maybe. What's firmer is what happened in Northern Europe. In places where grapes struggled, Normandy, Brittany, the Basque country, the west of England, apples didn't. By the medieval period, cider was a serious agricultural product with dedicated presses, dedicated varieties, and a real economy behind it. Charlemagne's estate records mention cider makers among the skilled workers on royal land. Cider got used to pay rents and tithes, which tells you it functioned as money. And that's the tradition that got on a boat. The English who settled Massachusetts brought apple seeds and grafting wood with them. They also brought honeybees, because apples need pollinators, and the native ones weren't cut out for the job. A settler named William Blackston is generally credited with the first real apple orchard in Boston, around the 1620s, and later with breeding what may be the first named American variety. Apple trees went in within a decade of landing. That's how urgent this was. Here's the biology that decides everything after this point. Apples don't come true from seed. Plant a seed from a great apple, and you don't get that apple. You get a genetic lottery ticket, a tree bearing fruit that looks nothing like the parent, and usually tastes terrible. The trade calls them spitters. To get an edible variety you have to graft. Take a cutting from a known tree and physically attach it to a rootstock. Every Honeycrisp on Earth is a clone of one original tree. Grafting takes skill, wood, and time. Seeds are free, and you can carry a year's worth in a sack. So a frontier farmer planting from seed got an orchard of spitters. And spitters are perfect for one thing. Press them. Let the wild yeast take over, and the tannin and acid that make them awful to eat make the cider good. So the Colonial orchard wasn't a snack. It was a machine for turning a hillside into a drinkable, storable, tradable liquid. Which brings us to the water question. The standard story says colonists drank cider because water was lethal. The Smithsonian's own historians call that only half true, and the specifics matter. Out on a farm, with a well dug away from the privy, water was usually fine. And there are plenty of colonial diaries where people drink it without drama. In cities, it was a different story. Boston's water was described by people living there as hard, discolored, foul-smelling, and sometimes just polluted, because nothing stopped runoff from outhouses, tanneries, and slaughterhouses from reaching the wells. Jamestown's water was genuinely awful. Researchers have found arsenic, salt, and fecal contamination in that aquifer. But the deeper reason is cultural. Nobody in 17th century England drank water as their default beverage. The English drank ale, the Dutch beer, the French wine. Water was what you resorted to. That habit crossed the Atlantic intact, and it ran into a landscape where barley was difficult early on, and apple trees were easy. Add in the fact that cider is calories, that it keeps through winter when nothing else does, and that alcohol was considered actively healthful, and you don't need water to be deadly to explain it. You just need cider to be better. How much better? A survey from 1767 put per-person cider consumption in Massachusetts at roughly a barrel and a bit, somewhere around 35 gallons a year. That number gets quoted constantly, and it's worth saying it comes from a narrow source and shouldn't be treated as a national average. But even discounted, it's a lot of cider. The stuff functioned as infrastructure. Wages got paid in it. Tithes got paid in it. Ministers received it as part of their compensation. In some places, widows were guaranteed an annual supply. John Adams supposedly started his mornings with a tankard of hard cider and made it to 90. The story comes from his own diaries, though he was writing about cider's virtues more than logging a habit. Then somebody figured out you could make it stronger without a still. Leave a barrel outside in a New England winter, the water freezes, the alcohol doesn't, and you pull off the concentrated liquid in the middle. That's applejack, jacking, and it produced something far more potent than cider. A New Jersey family named Laird had been making it commercially since the 1700s, and their operation is generally recognized as holding the first distilling license issued in the United States in 1780. Now for the man in the storybook. John Chapman, born in Massachusetts in 1774, died in 1845. Real person, nurseryman. He collected apple seeds free from cider presses in Pennsylvania and moved west ahead of settlement, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, planting fenced nurseries on land he'd scouted, then returning to sell seedlings to arriving settlers. Territorial land rules helped him. Proving a claim often meant planting a set number of fruit trees, so an established orchard had legal value on top of agricultural value, and he would not graft. He was a devout Swedenborgian, and believed cutting and splicing a tree caused it real harm. Which means every tree he sold was a seedling. Which means every tree he sold produced spitters. Which means John Chapman spent 40 years supplying the American frontier with hard cider stock, and everybody buying from him understood that perfectly well. Historians differ on the man himself, part speculator, part missionary, part genuinely eccentric who walked barefoot and gave away stock to people who couldn't pay. What isn't in dispute is what the trees were for. Then the ground shifted. The temperance movement arrived in the 1810s and grew into a serious political force, and cider had a problem no other drink had. It was made at home, on the farm, by the same wholesome rural families temperance claimed to speak for. There's a widely told story about temperance activists taking axes to orchards, sometimes with a preacher leading the way. It shows up everywhere, and it does appear to have happened in places, but it's been repeated far past what the evidence supports. Treat the orchard chopping as a real thing that got inflated into legend. The bigger killers were less dramatic. German immigration brought lager brewing at industrial scale, and lager could be made in a city, year-round, cheap, and consistent. Cider is stuck, waiting on an autumn harvest. Americans moved off farms and into those cities, away from their own trees. Railroads and refrigeration made national beer brands possible. By the turn of the 20th century, beer had passed cider, and the gap was widening. Prohibition finished it. Orchards were abandoned or torn out, and the apple industry, watching its main customer become illegal, repositioned the fruit entirely. Apples were now wholesome, healthy, something you handed a child. The saying about an apple a day actually started as a Welsh proverb in the 1860s, well before any of this, but American growers leaned into that message hard. How much of the rebrand was deliberate strategy versus convenient timing is still argued over. Either way, the orchards got replanted for looks and sweetness, which is roughly when a variety found on an Iowa farm in the 1870s, renamed and marketed nationally, went on to become the most planted apple in America, and a byword for gorgeous fruit with nothing much going on inside. The bitter apples mostly vanished, and in America uniquely, the word cider stopped meaning alcohol at all and came to mean cloudy juice. Go back to that Massachusetts breakfast table. The kid with the watered-down cup wasn't being neglected, and his mother wasn't being reckless. She was handing him the most reliable liquid in the house, made from fruit that came from a Kazakh mountain forest, off a tree grown from a seed that produced something nobody could stand to eat, fermented in a barrel. Because that's what you did with a harvest you couldn't refrigerate, in a culture where water had never been the default drink in the first place. Not because water would kill him, because cider was food, medicine, wages, and winter storage in one cup. And water was just water. That whole system took about 200 years to build and about 80 to dismantle. What's happening now is people digging up nursery catalogs from the 1800s, hunting down bitter-sharp and bitter-sweet varieties that nearly went extinct, and replanting orchards full of apples deliberately chosen for being inedible. Do we see? The spitters are coming back. Turns out the apples nobody could eat were the ones that mattered. If this one hit, subscribe so the next Dawn of Eris episode finds you, and tell me in the comments which everyday thing you want pulled apart next. There's a jar in your fridge right now with a stranger backstory than you'd guess.